I have a hard time telling what the general consensus is sometimes, so I don't know if this is a hot take or not, but I'm just gonna come out and say it. I love Godzilla King of the Monsters. Now, I'll be the first to admit that it has a lot of problems. There's a few questionable writing choices, some jokes don't land, and sometimes the action is a little underexposed. But for me, that's not quite enough to ruin the movie. I completely respect people who don't like it, but I just think it's neat. I saw it twice in theaters, about 2 or 3 dozen times on DVD. I've read the novelization twice, I own the merch, and I listen to the soundtrack religiously. Needless to say, I'm a fan. And I really wanted to be a fan of the sequel, Godzilla vs. Kong, because I was hyped as hell for it. That trailer was awesome.
I keep reaching for greatness because I'm built from it.
Who bows to who?
Nobody gonna stop for me.
Kong bows to no one.
I remember reading the unhinged fan theories and being endlessly disappointed by it being delayed over and over and over again. And then it finally came out and I initially thought that I had just built it up so much in my mind that I had set myself up for disappointment. And after almost 3 years, I'm prepared to say that, while that is definitely a factor, the movie's also just not very good. None of it really makes any sense. It absolutely destroys the continuity of the universe, and it just feels like such a monumental downgrade from King of the Monsters. I'm not saying it's without any good qualities, but are all those enough to ruin the movie for me?
Yes.
And with the release of the next chapter in the Monsterverse, Godzilla x Kong the New Empire, on the horizon, unless they delay it again, I figured why keep putting this video off any longer? Also, please don't kill me for having these opinions. Now, to get us warmed up, we're going to start at the beginning. The credits. Now, I fully admit that these are all just nitpicks, but I also think the opening credits sum up the movie really well. Because it looks really cool, and it gets really hyped up. But if you really think about any of it, the cracks start to show. Like, they show Godzilla and Kong's stats on screen, and with 1 or 2 exceptions, not a single one of them is correct. Kong's stats are especially egregious since they were taken from Skull Island, where he was roughly a quarter of the size he is in this movie. In addition, they also show the stats of the Mutos and Skullcrawlers, and they include their binomial nomenclature. And that's a fun bit of world building I really liked from King of the Monsters. Like, Godzilla was Titanus Gojira, and Mothra was Titanus Mosura. However, here it's done badly. In Godzilla 2014 and Kong Skull Island, Muto was established as a generic moniker that the Monarch organization gives to all Titans before giving them a proper name.
My agency is known as Monarch. We specialize in the hunt for massive unidentified terrestrial organisms.
The Mutos we see in 2014 are called that because they kind of spring up out of nowhere before they can be named. So naturally their binomial is Titanus Muto. I couldn't find a super official source on when or if it's still canon at this point, but as far as I can tell, their nomenclature is supposed to be Titanus Jinshinmushi, a slight misspelling of the Japanese term Jishinmushi, meaning earthquake beetle, which is fun. And canon or not, anything is better than Titanus Muto. That's like naming your monster a giant condor. Anyway, the Skullcrawler's binomial was listed as Titanus Cranium Reptant. Cranium Reptant, I actually don't really have a problem with. It's the Titanus that's the issue now. Because all things considered, Skullcrawlers probably shouldn't be in the same grouping as, say, Godzilla. In Skull Island and parts of GVK, more on that in a bit, Skullcrawlers are about 12 feet tall. There's a really big one that's 95 feet, but not only is it an outlier, but that's still tiny next to pretty much every other Titan. But also all of it is made up, so it doesn't really matter. But before the credits finish, we get a bracket of battles from both monsters from the previous movies. And I could be dumb, but I don't think this is how brackets work. At the very least, it doesn't follow consistent rules. On one side, we have Kong fighting the Skull Devil and coming out victorious. Makes sense. And on the other side, we have Rodan fighting Methuselah, which not only did not happen, but also somehow Ghidorah wins. Also, I think Ghidorah fights himself. Again, I could be misreading it, but it seems a bit messy. Kinda like this movie. And this last point I wanted to mention, just because I think it's interesting. I'm not entirely sure if it's a mistake or not. They show Godzilla and Kong's names written in Japanese right before they show the title card. Cool. Now, the Monsterverse has been very particular about not calling Kong King Kong. I assume because of complicated legal reasons. They've always skirted around it and just called him Kong.
That's Kong. He's king around here.
And yet here they have King Kong written in Japanese. Now, the Japanese title for Skull Island does call him King Kong, but as far as I can tell, the Japanese version of GVK, or at the very least the trailer, still refers to him simply as Kong. I don't know, it's weird. From what I understand, the credits were made towards the very, very end of production, so they were really rushed and they pretty much just Googled stuff, which explains a lot, actually. And I sympathize with that to a degree, but also, stealing fan art isn't cool, but I do appreciate a lot of other little details in the credits too. They keep the text redaction style that both previous Monsterverse Godzilla movies had and combine it with the quotes like Skull Island had. They include Godzilla's nuclear pulse attack, one of my favorites, and I especially like the note about the female Muto being killed by the kiss of death. As I said, those were just nitpicks, an appetizer if you will. Let's get into the actual reasons I don't like this movie. People always say that nobody watches Godzilla movies for the human characters. And I can't exactly argue with that. The whole point is to see a big lizard fight thing. However, I would also argue that the best Godzilla movies are the ones with good human casts. 54, Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, Gigan, GMK, Godzilla against Mechagodzilla, Shin, you get the idea. Now, the cast of King of the Monsters is controversial to say the least.
What? She's a gonorrhea.
But I like them. And the reason I like them is because they have motivations and interpersonal conflict. Mark is a depressed, alcoholic, divorced dad who just wants his family back. His ex-wife Emma is similarly depressed but deals with it by burying herself in her work, which happens to involve dabbling in bioterrorism to avenge her dead son, but that's neither here nor there. Serizawa is trying to prove that Godzilla's not a threat to humanity, and everyone else is just trying to not die, with mixed results. They're a fun little group, and the novelization expands further on several of them. But you know what the cast of GVK doesn't have? Any of that? They're just meatbags full of exposition. The only reason I care about any of them is because I like the actors playing them, and to be quite honest, that's not enough to carry the story. But lucky for me, the cast is split right down the middle between characters relevant to Kong and characters relevant to Godzilla. That should make organizing my complaints a real breeze. Something that comes up a lot in reviews of GVK is that the Kong storyline's characters are way better than the ones in Godzilla's story. And I disagree. Mostly. Out of the three main characters in Kong's story, one of them is a good character, and that's being very generous. I mean, G is cool, I like her, she has a really sweet relationship with Kong, and the actress Kaylee Hoddle does a really good job. She's talented, and I'm happy she's coming back for the new Empire, but that's about it. She isn't super complex, and in any other movie she wouldn't really need to be. But here, she's carrying this half of the story. The other two main characters, Nathan Lind and Eileen Andrews, I only like because I like other movies that Alexander Skarsgård and Rebecca Hall were in. Side note, go watch The Northman, it's really good. Nathan actually has a lot of potential. Really, they both do, but the novelization actually goes in depth with him. One of the first chapters is a detailed account of his brother's trip into the Hollow Earth, which doesn't make much sense, but we'll get back to that. But that's followed by his death. And you learn later how Nathan feels somewhat responsible for it since he was one of the tech guys on the project. And this might just be my interpretation, but I read it as Nathan getting closure for what he perceives as his mistake by following Kong on his journey of discovering his ancestral home. It's not perfect, but I like it. And the movie doesn't really have any of that. The backstory about his brother is basically a footnote in his introductory scene, and his arc is reduced to him learning how to be less of a bitch. That's about it. Eileen doesn't get much more added depth in the novelization, but I still think there's a lot of room to expand her character. I'd love to know more about her relationship with Gia, how that's grown since Gia lost her family, and how she feels about not getting through to Kong while Gia can. You know, interpersonal drama, something compelling. You get a minuscule taste of some of that in the movie, but it's rarely, if ever, the focus. Because without any of that, she's just kind of a belligerent asshat.
How about we throw you off instead, huh?
These three in Kong are supposed to be the emotional core of the movie, and they are so critically lacking. They have all the pieces, and it's like they actively chose to not do anything interesting. I don't understand. The only other recurring character in this half of the story is Maya Simmons, and she's just a goon for the main villain, who we'll get back to. She's just a stereotypical rich girl, and even then they somehow manage to write her inconsistently. When Godzilla first attacks the boat, they mention that Godzilla came to kill Kong, which we'll get back to. And Maya says,
Him? Then dump him, dump the monkey.
which is a little cold, but given the situation, fairly reasonable. Godzilla's killing so many people, the most logical thing to do would be to let loose the big monkey. It's what they end up doing, it's what Eileen says to do, yet Maya is still framed as the bad guy. Before this, she's just been a bit of an asshole, and afterwards she rushes to help Gia after the ship capsizes. What exactly am I supposed to think of this character, Eric? I guess I'm supposed to hate her because at the end she just decides to be evil and let literally everyone else die so that she can email her evil dad a magic power source for his robot. I don't understand this movie. And then she just gets crushed to death. You could have had something with her and her dad, who I'd like to mention don't share any dialogue or even a scene with each other. But instead you gave us nothing, and you couldn't even do that right. Speaking of her dad, let's talk about Godzilla's human sidekicks, because they somehow managed to simultaneously be less and more infuriating. As I mentioned, a common criticism of this movie is that Godzilla's characters don't hold a candle to Kong's. And again, I don't really get that. The Kong crew were supposed to be the emotional core, and they fail miserably. The Godzilla gang are all glorified comic relief, and they achieve mixed results. Let's start with Madison. Madison is a holdover from King of the Monsters, and I wouldn't really say she was a standout character in that movie. She's a little plain, I guess, but she serves her purpose as part of that movie's emotional core, which I think works, but to each their own. And that movie's novelization actually expands on her quite a bit, particularly all the trauma of her brother being killed in a Godzilla attack and her parents' marriage falling apart in the aftermath of it. In this movie, she's also not super developed, but she also feels like a completely different person. You could call that off-screen development, but I'd call that lazy writing. For all intents and purposes, she was just a normal-ass person in King of the Monsters. Now she's a conspiracy theorist and has no concept of human behavior for some reason. This movie's novelization actually mentions that she was diagnosed with PTSD, and that would have made her at least slightly more of a character. It would have made her more identifiable, more interesting. Hell, include a realistic depiction of a panic attack for all I care. Just do something with her, she feels so wasted. Also, side tangent, but I watched Megan recently, and there's this guy in that movie played by Ronnie Ching, and it took me like 30 minutes to remember where I'd seen this man before, and I realized that he's the convenience store owner in this movie who makes a Tide Pod challenge reference.
This isn't one of those internet challenge things, because when I saw those kids those detergent pods, I didn't know they were gonna eat them.
And I'd like to mention that that wasn't even a topical reference when the previous movie came out. Anyway, Maddie's sidekicks are Bernie and Josh, who I like slightly more because they have slightly more personality. Josh is the straight man to everyone else's funny guy shtick, and Bernie is
100% butt fucking sane.
That's really all there is to them. Bernie at least has the very basic backstory of having a dead wife, which the novelization expands on as being the main reason he's trying to take down Apex Cybernetics. It really should have been in the movie, But Josh doesn't get squat. Again, I only really like them because they have a few funny lines and I've seen the actors in other movies. I don't recommend you watch Eternals, but Brian Tyree Henry is one of the very few good things in it. And then we come to the main human villain of the film, Walter Simmons. And can I just say, another tangent, that I love how every single villain in the Monsterverse has the least threatening name ever. Here we have Walter, King of the Monsters had Alan, and Skull Island had Preston. Anyway, Walt here wants to build Mechagodzilla. Why? Because. I'm not kidding, we don't get much more of an answer than that. He starts this whole monologue about how humanity rules, Godzilla rules, and then Mechagodzilla bitch slaps him out of existence halfway through. And the movie just moves on.
That's unfair. I really wanted to hear the rest of that speech.
I like Damian Bichir, he's got some charisma, I like the way he says Godzilla.
He's our best shot against Godzilla.
And that's it. There's no relationship with his daughter, not even an inkling of a backstory, barely even a motivation, really. Something humanity is the apex predator, that's why his company is called Apex. Yawn. In King of the Monsters, Alan had a backstory. He's an ex-soldier, driven by cynicism, unwinds by committing acts of eco-terrorism. Also, he traffics giant monster genetic samples as a side gig. And we weren't privy to many more of the details, but I think the mystery kind of adds to it. And again, the novelization expands on him a bit too. But also, Charles Dance is a pleasure to watch in anything.
Madison, tell me, what exactly did Mummy sell you on? Some grand utopia? Man and monster living together in blissful harmony?
But now, let's just follow him up with the most boring man alive. And also, what even is Walter's plan? Ignoring his lack of motivation, what does he expect to get out of any of this? He wants to use Mechagodzilla to kill Godzilla, I guess. But what happens after that? Godzilla's the alpha titan, and he's the only thing keeping the others in hibernation, or at least that's the excuse as to why they're not in this movie. They throw around the phrase bioacoustics a lot in King of the Monsters, which I'm still not entirely sure what really means, but I would hazard a guess that Mechagodzilla probably doesn't have any, what with him being a robot. In all likelihood, Mechagodzilla has no domain over any of them, unless you stuff the Orca in him too, which Monarch probably wouldn't be willing to do. So if any other monster comes out of hibernation, is Walter just hoping that Mechagodzilla is strong enough to take him? Because I can say with some amount of certainty that one EMP blast from a Muto on Mechagodzilla's finished. Anyway, there's also the matter of Mark, Madison's dad, who is completely irrelevant to the story. The main character of the last movie just pops in every now and then to do basically nothing. And he's also way more dismissive of Madison than he really should be. Like, Godzilla attacks Apex in Florida, seemingly unprovoked, and Maddie points that out to him. Mark himself made a big deal in King of the Monsters about Godzilla's behavior not making sense and trying to rationalize it.
When an animal leaves its hunting ground, it's usually because it's threatened by something.
And yet here, he's just like, oh, he's just evil now, that raises no suspicion.
There has to be a pattern here.
There doesn't.
A reason why he was provoked.
There isn't.
How do you know that?
Because creatures, like people, can change.
His whole arc in the last movie was making peace with Godzilla, who he blamed for the death of his son. I don't like to throw around the phrase character assassination too often, but I think this is like the textbook definition. But it's a character no one cares about, so I guess it doesn't matter. And also, Mark has, I guess he's his assistant? He has a guy who stands next to him for one or two scenes. I don't know what he's supposed to be in the movie. Again, the novelization goes into great detail that I do not remember because he's irrelevant either way. But whatever he is, he's played by the late, great Lance Reddick. This guy, who is in 3 shots and says 2 lines, is randomly played by this absolute legend of a man. Why would you waste him on a role as minuscule and unimportant? It's like killing off Bryan Cranston less than halfway through your movie. Oh wait! I love the John Wick movies, and I won't pretend they used Lance Reddick super well in all 4 of them, but he was still an important part of them. He at least got a fucking name. But yes, I guess Kong's characters are slightly better than Godzilla's, but only by like the tiniest margin possible. I guess it all depends on whether you think nothing is better or worse than a bad something. But people familiar with GVK may have noticed that there's a certain character that I neglected to mention. But rest assured, I did not forget him. He gets his own section. Ren Serizawa is, like Maya, basically just a henchman of Walter. Just from watching the movie, you wouldn't think he's important at all. However, if you read the novelization, or just read his last name and inferred, you know that he's the son of Ishiro Serizawa, one of the main characters from 2014 in King of the Monsters. And that isn't something exclusive to the novelization, like, for some reason the timelines are different between the two of them. The novel is set 3 years after King of the Monsters, the movie is 5. But as far as I can tell, Ren being Ishiro's son is canon to both of them. And that relationship in itself has limitless potential. And the novel spends a lot of time in Ren's head going over all of his issues. They explain that he felt his father cared more about Godzilla than he did his own son. Ishiro spent all of his life researching Godzilla and advocating for his power for good and didn't spend even a second playing catch with Ren. In 2014, you see Ishiro disregard his own safety just to get a glimpse at Godzilla's back. And to add to the tragedy, in the King of the Monsters novel, they mention how Ishiro regrets not spending more time with his son right before he sacrifices his life to save Godzilla. And in the GVK novel, Ren blames Godzilla for taking his father away from him. Neither Ren nor Ishiro got closure with one another, so Ren joins Walter just so he can have a chance to kill the source of all his strife. He's not piloting Mechagodzilla because humanity blah blah blah. He's in it for revenge. Aside from maybe Gia, Ren is the only other character with personal stakes in the monster plot. So, why is it that in the movie we get... Well, fucking none of that! He's just a guy who follows Walter around for a few scenes and then gets brain blasted by Ghidorah's ghost possessing Mechagodzilla. You had all this great material, and for what? An extra henchman who has like 7 lines? Early on in the film, Godzilla attacks one of Walter's facilities, and amidst the chaos, there's a short scene where Ren watches Godzilla destroying everything. And I think the actor Shun Oguri really sells the hatred in his face. You can tell there's more to the character than what we see later. It's one of my favorite scenes of the movie, and it's just never followed up on. And this isn't as big of a deal, but whoever edited the Japanese trailer for the movie is a real dickhead. They took 2 parts of Walter and Ren's conversation with Nathan, trying to convince him to find the magic power source.
Godzilla has never attacked us unprovoked before. These are dangerous times, Dr. Lind. Allow me to introduce our Apex Chief Technology Officer, Mr. Ren Serizawa.
And edited it to make it seem like Walter is trying to convince Ren to join him.
Mr. Ren Serizawa, these are dangerous times.
It really makes it seem like Ren's going to have a much more pivotal role, but no. They set me up to be disappointed, not me. If I'm being honest, Ren should have been the main character. You can keep Gia and the gang, maybe even Madison, but Ren has so much potential for an amazing story. But no, he's just here for the Evangelion reference. Ren is one of the main reasons I wanted to make this video to begin with. The fact that he's wasted this badly enrages me beyond all reason. However, Ren is only one of the reasons GVK makes me angry.